Um, John, it's just made it to us now. I want to welcome you to this talk, and mate, I'll hand it over to you. Is there any? I'm just going to give it your way.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you guys for doing this again. And we got to stop meeting like this. You bring me to Australia. Uh, I'll come for $10 US. It's been too long, but I thank you guys. Thank you, Steve, for doing this. Um, Fellas, I was telling Steve, I sort of did a misstep when I planned this talk. For some reason, I thought, how you get old and you tell yourself shit that you just make up and you think, well, whatever I think is right. But for some reason, I thought men and women came last year, and I was thinking maybe I'll do something that would appeal to both. That's why I took the subject of this new book and some of the ideas that I'm going to throw out. So it's not specifically geared to, if y'all have me back next year, I promise I'll not talk to myself and just read the flyer and see what it says. So anyway, thank you all very much. Thanks again, Steve, for having me. Gosh, I don't know how many times we've done this, but it seems like it's been quite a few years.
Yep. Maybe a few now, for sure.
Yeah. So I'm going to do some things, but on thinking about you men and how much Robert Bly meant to you, many of you, and many of you know how much he meant to me. He died this past year. He would have been 95 on December the 22nd had he lived. And I just got back from a memorial service. And that was quite something. But one of the things that I have done everywhere I go, no matter whether it's a men's thing or a mixed gender thing or a conference, I always bring at some point, either at the beginning of the talk or middle or the end, something by him as a way to pay tribute to the man who, has influenced my life and recovery and my work with men for all these years. So I always read something by him, and sometimes I tell stories. But tonight, I'll just read you a short poem that I think you'll like. It's called Things to Think, and it's from my much used book of his called Morning Poems. You can see I've been carrying it around for quite some time. And the poem goes like this: think in ways you've never thought before. Now that is what we're going to try to do tonight with the content that I'm going to present. That's part of the reason why I chose this poem. Think in ways you've never thought before. If the phone rings, think of it as carrying a message larger than anything you've ever heard, vaster than 100 lines of Yeats. Think that someone may bring a bear to your door, may be wounded and deranged, or think that a moose has risen out of the lake and he's carrying on his shoulders and antlers a child of your own whom you've never seen. Now, this next stanza is why I read this poem with so much passion, and I hope it comes through. When someone knocks on the door, think that he's about to give you something large, tell you you've been forgiven, or that it's not necessary to work all the time, or that it's been decided if you lie down, no one will die. You like that last part?
Yeah.
Ends if you like it. Let me read it again. When someone knocks on your door, think that he's about to give you something large. Tell you that you've been forgiven. Wouldn't that be the greatest job in the world? Is you go from door to each man that's worked so hard, and you knock on the door and say, I got a message for you. You've been forgiven. Or that it's not necessary to work all the time. Or that it's been decided if you lie down, no one will die. So there you have it. A good poem by Robert Bly. Now, I got to tell you guys, I say this every time I do a podcast or a webinar, that I love doing things in person and have been doing things, been teaching and lecturing and doing workshops for 38 years. And this technology, especially during the virus, has been essential to keep working and keep putting out some of the stuff that I think and talking to clients and stuff. But I'm very awkward with the whole technology because I really can't hear you or see you as well as I'd like. So you just bear with me, and I'm gonna do some talking about this little book that came out a few months ago. And let me tell you how this book and some of this stuff came about real quick. When I was 25 years old, I was teaching part-time at the University of Alabama, but I needed to supplement my income. And so I got a job as a counselor at what was called back then the Center for Emotionally Disturbed Children. And what that really should have been was the Center for Emotionally Disturbed Adults who had children, but they sent the children there. And, you know, I worked there for quite some time. But what happened was, and I talk about it in this little book, is when there would be these staff meetings where the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the social worker, the nurse, and us counselors would sit around the table and we would come up with a treatment plan for each of these kids. And so the psychiatrist would say, well, for this little boy, JT, we need to increase his points and make it harder for him to get his points. And for this little girl, we need to up her dosage of medication. And for this little girl, we need to make sure that she spends more time in timeout. So this was a million years ago, and most of you probably hadn't had this experience. At least I hope you haven't. But the bottom line is when the treatment plan was finished, the head psychiatrist would say, so we're all in agreement that this is what needs to happen with these kids, except for John, right? and that would be the case. I would never agree with what they were doing because it was totally behavior modification, you know, timeouts, medication. And I just go, no, you know, I mean, come on, let's treat these kids a little bit more like humans. One kid was peeing in the bed. He was a little black boy, 9 years old, and he would pee every night in his bed. And so the treatment team would want to put an electric pad underneath him to shock him when he peed. And I just go, this is totally insane. You know, you're going to shock him. He's already distressed. He's already hurting, and you're going to shock him with electricity. And they go, well, that's what we do here, and that's how it goes. And I said, how about me taking him home for a week and letting him stay at my house after the shift and see what happens? And they agreed. I don't know why they agreed, or let a 25-year-old take a little black boy home in Alabama, but they did. And so he would say, Mr. Lee, you know, I'm going to pee on the bed. And I'd say, JT, you know what? If you pee on the bed, we'll get up in the morning and you'll take the mattress out and put it outside and it'll dry out. And then when we come home in the evening, you can put the mattress back on your bed. It'll be okay. And so the first night he peed, second night he peed, and he had to drag this big old mattress out every night, every morning, and let it dry. And then for the next 4 or 5 nights, he didn't pee. And I really believe in part it was because the mattress was heavy, you know, but also in part because I didn't really care that he peed on my mattress. And I sure cared that I wasn't going to put an electric pad under the little boy's butt. And so I tell this story, probably too long of a story, to say somewhere around then that started my career in psychology, in recovery, in personal growth, in men's issues, saying I want to look at things somewhat differently, maybe, and employ those differences in some way that might help people. So I've always been an odd one out, and that's why I call the book this. So I'm going to give you some ideas that I've been working with for 10, 20, 30 years. I don't know that they'll be relevant to you. I don't know how helpful they'll be to you, but here we go for what it's worth. So let's see. Where would I like to start? All right. So in the first chapter, I talk about how therapists, counselors, psychologists, doctors, the general public use the words anxiety and fear as if they mean the same thing. And so I got to thinking about it over the years and thinking, you know what, they really are different. And if they're different, then we need to work with people in counseling and in therapy and in lives in general with that difference. So this is what the dictionary says about fear. It says, quote, fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous or likely to cause pain or a threat. The dictionary goes on to say, anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, a dis-ease about a certain outcome. Now, again, I don't know if y'all, your language, you know, I know you speak English, but, you know, you have your own way of speaking down under. But what I'm saying here is that fear is one thing and anxiety is something else. Fear is, I'm afraid of dogs. I'm afraid of the dark. I'm afraid of flying, whatever your fears are. And anxiety is, I'm afraid of the unknown. I don't know what's coming. I don't know what's going to happen. And so, as one philosopher says of anxiety, anxiety is a feeling of restlessness, a feeling that one has not finished something, or that one has to look for something. So, if they're different, then they need to be treated differently. And so that's what I'm doing in this book, is separating these things. Now, again, because it's really almost like I'm talking into this little screen here. But if what I read and said makes sense, raise your hands or something. And if it doesn't make sense, raise your hand and tell me, and I'll go back over it. I'm going to do 4 or 5 or 6 of these little things for what they're worth. So big difference. Fear has an object, something to be afraid of. Anxiety does not have an object, and we don't know why we're afraid, but it's basically one way to say it is anxiety is the fear of the unknown. Okay?
Yeah, John, I can certainly hear you, and it's clear. And I imagine each man will have their own experience and questions around that. I know when I was reading through this book in the last couple of weeks, and I remember reading that, and it promotes other questions like would anxiety then the big thing of anxiety could a lot of unexpressed fears, fears of real things that you don't get to because you avoid them, then sort of build in, they become a bit blinding, and then you just sort of feel anxious, but now it's all too big, and it feels, so I just wondered that's what questions that come up for me, but I'm sure there'd be other questions.
Yeah. Well, just think of anxiety is, I don't know what's coming.
Yep.
I don't know. And then the second part, guys, is I don't know where I'm going after this. See, people say, well, I'm afraid of death. Okay, I'm afraid, some people are afraid of death, but anxiety is about, I don't know what's going to happen after death. Now, believers, Christians, devout people, a lot of people feel like they do know what's going to happen after one passes, but not everybody feels that way. Now, I'm going to give you one solution for anxiety that is posed by a Christian theologian named Paul Tillich, which some of you may recognize or know. He says, one of the cures for anxiety, for not knowing what's going to happen, one of the cures for anxiety is to, quote, believe you are accepted. Believe you are accepted. And you just have to sort of figure for yourself why he thinks that's a cure. But that calmness and that peacefulness of what's going to happen, what's going to come, he says, if you will believe and trust that you are accepted, that will reduce the anxiety a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to do, in the second chapter, I got a little discussion, and I hope this will help, particularly you guys in recovery. This is more of a recovery topic. But I make a distinction between the differences between caring for someone and caretaking someone. And the differences are huge, and the differences need to be employed because they can make all the difference in the world in how you relate to people that you do care about and love. Caretaking emanates out of duty, obligation, and guilt. Caretaking emanates or is created out of guilt, duty, or obligation. Caring for is created and emanates out of love, compassion, and empathy. I'm going to say it again. Caring for is birthed out of love, compassion, and empathy. Caretaking is born out of guilt, obligation, or duty. Caretaking says, I'm superior than you, that you need my assistance whether you want it or not. You need my counsel whether you want it or not. And caretaking leaves everybody feeling tired and exhausted. Caring for people gives us energy. It gives us energy. Caretaking ends up with the person that is receiving it, ends up with some resentment. And because I'm caretaking you out of guilt or duty or obligation, I may feel resentment. Where caring for, nobody is going to feel exhausted. Nobody's going to feel resented. Everybody's going to feel enlarged and invigorated and energized in some way. Does that make sense? Raise your hands if it does.
Yeah.
Now, I came to this because for many years, especially as a boy, teenager, young adult, later, midlife, early midlife, there was still way too much caretaking instead of caring for. And as counselors and therapists, or just partners in marriage, or if you've got aging parents still alive, my dad just turned 94 the other day. He's still alive. Mom's 92. It's very important that I make sure that I'm caring for them, not caretaking them. Okay? Ooh, I'm just rattling on here like I haven't done in a long time.
Hey, John, can I ask you? I mean, I always have identified, and I think a lot of some of the guys I do know here identified with that, early literature, Flying Boy, and at my father's wedding and stuff, and that idea that for men, that the duty that you called for, right? That for some of us, our fathers were busy, we got their time, not their temperament, and that we were sort of enlisted in with mother to look after mother, and nearly some of us to the point of surrogate spouse. And that if we don't get conscious about that we're likely then to go off and out of duty, exhaust ourselves. Instead of caring for someone, sort of also includes that you've got your own boundaries that allow.
Yes.
And so that's why my understanding of that, where I base it in your work. But I don't know if you want to.
No, that's exactly, Steve, how I got it. I took care of my mother and got praised for it, got validated for it, was told what a good boy I was for taking care of my mother. And so when I just kept doing that with the people that I was around, because part of the thing, like you're saying, is in where I grew up in the years that I grew up, men were supposed to take care of, and you're right about boundaries. If I'm caring for you, I have good boundaries in place, and I damn sure respect your boundaries. Whereas caretaking, everybody is boundaryless.
And you might get to this in another section of what you're talking about, but further on in the book, what I also wonder for you, when you're taking care of others, you don't expect too much of others and therefore miss them. And you write about one of the partners you had that you would do acts of love, buy them flowers and this and that, but there was an occasion where you asked of her to read one of your manuscripts and she got very emotional and you really wanted to understand what's going on, and she was longing for that, imagine that partnership with you to be respected in that way. I think your line was that that you loved her respectfully, and
Right.
instead of doing good things for her and caretaking her, you were inviting her in, right? Is that
Yeah.
sort of an extension of
Yeah,
what?
absolutely, bud.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, back in Flying Boy 2, I had this dream. I was with this woman, and in the dream, I was swinging on a rope that was hung from a tree, and I was swinging on a rope over a lake, and I was having such a good time. I was in the dream. I was free and easy and relaxed, and I looked down in the lake. I'll never forget this dream. I looked down in the lake, and I saw a woman's hand coming up out of the lake. And I thought, oh my God, she's in distress. I need to take care of her. And I think, but I don't want to let go of the swing. I'm having such a great time. I don't want to let go, but I better let go and go into the water and take care of her. And so I let go of the swing, you might say I let go of myself out of duty, obligation, and guilt, and went down into the water and kept diving into the water deeper and deeper. And I came upon a cave down there, and she was in this wonderful, beautiful house in the cave, and it was lovely, and she was not distressed at all. There was no problem at all. And all I could think of is I gave up myself, my fun, my peace, to caretake somebody who didn't even need to be taken care of, if that makes sense. Anybody done that before? Taking care of somebody and you kind of look back and go, they didn't really need me to do that, you know?
John.
Yes.
Yeah, I just got to. I'm going through a little bit of stuff at the moment with working out boundaries with my youngest child, and I've been around the fellowship for a long time, and I've heard for years and years about letting someone learn their own lessons. You know, not trying to completely shelter them from life's pains and hurts. But I'm been really struggling with that lately, and when I've been looking a little bit deeper into it, realizing that I get a real feel good out of doing those actions. It's not purely out of my love or anything like that. I get a benefit when I do it. It builds my chronic low self-esteem up when I think that I'm of value to somebody else. And
Yes.
when that value is being recognized, I'm in the mix of euphoria around it. But as soon as it starts to go pear-shaped, or I don't get the responses that I like, or I get pointed out from somebody else that what you're doing is more harm than more good, then I just completely collapse around all that stuff and then just recess into my low self-esteem again. It just reinforces and then I judge myself to think, fucking hell, all you're doing is just doing this for yourself. It's not about them, it's about you. You feel that low, you need to constantly go out of your way to try and prove my worth as a man, a father, whatever. So that's my experience in that lately, and I'm still going through it.
I hear you. I hear you. You know, this is the thing. Many men have taken on this false hero thing because it does give us validation and affirmation. It does raise our self-esteem, but it's not as altruistic or other-centered as it might look like. You know, the shadow side of the hero is, I'm going to do this stuff more for me than for you, with the hopes that you will praise me and that I'll feel good and I'll feel better. And so, you know, one of the things that many men have to do is look at are we still playing the hero role? Now, one of the things that I say in this book too is this phrase, where there's roles, there's rage. Where there's roles, there's rage. That if I'm playing the dutiful son or the hero or the wise father, if I'm playing a role, then you're going to have some rage towards me. I'm going to have some rage towards you, because one of the things that every person on the planet wants is to be seen and heard. But if we're inhabiting a role, that will limit how much we're going to really be seen and heard. And it will limit how much we see and hear the other person. So part of this is looking at the roles that we're playing, still playing, and maybe beginning to dismantle those roles. One of the book that I'm writing and working on now is titled, and it's going to be a podcast in January for this group called The Odyssey of Aging, From Hero to Elder. And so I won't talk about it now, but just some thoughts on that. Okay, what am I going to do next? And let's see. Okay, here's a little thought that's in this next chapter, and we won't spend very much time on it. We want to get to some others, but one of the things that I do in counseling and try to do in life in general is to convey to people that there's no such thing as a designated problem in a family, in a marriage, in a group. That there's no such thing as the designated problem. And many people, men especially very often, will take on this mantle or this identification as I'm the designated problem. And if I'll get fixed, everything will be okay. Or she or they are the designated problem. And if they'll get into therapy and get into recovery, everything will be okay. And so one of the things that I try to do, especially when I'm working with families, is to get it across that before we even get started, you need to understand that I work from the idea that there's no such thing as the designated problem. And so if you've been sort of accused or identified as the designated problem, you're going to have to work to give that up. Or if you've been identifying somebody as the designated problem, and if they would just get their act together, we would be okay. So again, these are just some ideas that I'm throwing out. Here's another one I think that will help, especially men in recovery, maybe a little bit, but just men in general. One of the things that I say to people in session when I'm working with them or at a workshop or something, and I say, okay, you did such and such, or you said such and such. How did that make you feel? And very often the person within a split second will utter the words, it makes me feel guilty, or I feel guilty. And one of the things I talk about in here, and I've been teaching therapists and counselors for a long time, is that guilt is not a feeling. It's a judgment. It's an analysis of behavior, but it's not a feeling. And what happens is we will answer and say, oh, I feel guilty about that. which is really code for I don't want to feel what I really feel about that. I don't want to go deeper than that. And so when a client or a workshop participant says, "Oh, John, you know, when I said that to my mother, I felt terribly guilty," I say, "You know what? I'm going to suspend the word guilt as if it has never been invented. And you can't use the word to describe your feelings about what you said to your husband or wife or son. What word would you put in place of the word guilt?" Everybody with me on this?
Yes.
So if I say, "Steve, how did that make you feel when you was short with your kids?" And you say, "Oh, John, I feel really guilty about that." I'm going to say, "Steve, that word doesn't exist. Now give me a word that really tells me how you feel about kind of yelling at your kid or being short with your kid." And then you got to go a layer deeper and come up with the real feeling word. Now, most of the time, those real feeling words tend to be sad, hurt, scared, angry, disappointed, whatever, but they're all feeling words. And what I've tried to do is eliminate out of my language this idea of "I feel guilty." Actually, I feel sad that I yelled at my dog. I feel scared that I raised my voice to my wife. And now I can do something about those feelings. Okay?
Yes.
Would shame come into that? Would shame be the same as guilt?
No, shame, you know, shame is a really tough one. People use shame and guilt, those two words interchangeably a lot of times. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the definition of the two, but I'm going to give them to you now. Is when people say they're guilty, that usually means that they've made a mistake, they've made an error, they've made a bad choice. So guilt says, "I made a mistake." Shame says, "I am a mistake." Guilt says, "I did something wrong that I need to correct and make amends for." Shame says, "I am something wrong, and no matter what I do or say, I can never get rid of that." So again, they're two very different ideas, but people use these words interchangeably a lot of time as if they mean the same thing. Okay, I got maybe one more, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So this one is much more difficult, and we'll spend a little more time on it. But what I'm going to deal with now is the difference between despair and depression. I've wrestled with depression on and off all my life, but I've also wrestled, especially in my later years, with despair. And I'll tell you how I came to this. I was giving a lecture at a talk at one of the men's conferences that Robert and I did for years up in Minnesota. And I just started working on these ideas about the difference between these two. And about midway in the talk, I saw a man in the back of the hall, and he was crying and sobbing. And so, of course, that didn't bother me. I kept on with my talk, but I kept noticing that something was really touching him. So at the end of my little talk, I said to the guy, I said, "Do you mind telling me and the group what's bringing all these tears forth?" And he said, well, I realized for the first time that I've got to go home and apologize to my wife for something she's been saying to me and I've been saying to her for 25 years. And I said, well, what were you saying to her all those years? And he said, I've been telling her she's depressed and she needs to deal with that depression. She needs to get on medication, or she needs to go to therapy, or go see a shaman or something, but she needs to deal with this depression. And I said, well, what would she say back to that? And he said, every time she would say, you don't understand, it's not depression. It's not depression. You got to understand. And he said, now I understand that this is what she's talking about. Despair. So, what is the difference between despair and depression? Depression is either a biochemical or situational issue that the brain chemistry is not firing, the emotions have been repressed for so long that one can be depressed. You take therapy, perhaps medication, and some prayer maybe, and the depression may lift or even go away permanently. Despair is something that we don't talk about anymore. We don't even hardly use the word despair anymore, but it's a condition of longing. I'm going to actually read you what I said here. Depression is a biological and emotional quest for light, relief, and balance. Depression gives nothing and takes everything: sleep, food, relationships, and much more. Despair is caused by self-betrayal and giving up on our deepest desires. It is a result of the risks not taken, the love not received, or the love not spoken. And a philosopher, John Burnside, said, quote, nothing I know matters more than what never happened. Despair is the continual frustration and even anger over some unspoken or spoken contract or agreement with ourselves, each other, or the divine has been broken and dishonored. Now, again, whether that's useful, touching, informative, I don't know. But I do know that I work with a lot of men, especially who are 50, 60 and over. And a lot of them are demonstrating the examples of despair. And I know myself as a 71-year-old man, some of what I just read, reason why I wrote it. Despair is caused by self-betrayal and giving up on our deepest desires. It is the result of the risks not taken, the love not received or spoken. So most men after 40 are going to have to maybe wrestle with their depression, but they may also need to be treated differently for their despair. So with that, I'm going to stop blabbing and reading and being weird, technologically speaking. And now, Steve, can I open it up for questions for a little bit?
You certainly can, John. I'm just going to, what I'll do, guys, is just stop the recording.